The wind howled outside, rattling the windows of Kylie's small, secluded home nestled deep in the woods. The trees swayed violently, their shadows dancing like twisted figures on the walls of her living room. It was one of those nights where the darkness felt alive, pressing against the glass, waiting for an opportunity to seep inside. Kylie sat on her couch, wrapped in a blanket, trying to focus on the book in her hands. But her mind kept wandering. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The house was too quiet, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards settling. She told herself it was just her imagination, the result of too many true crime documentaries before bed. But deep down, she knew better. It started with a sound, a faint, almost imperceptible tapping on the back door. Kylie froze, her heart skipping a beat. She held her breath, straining to listen. The tapping came again, louder this time, more deliberate. Her stomach churned as she slowly set her book down and stood up, her legs trembling beneath her. The rational part of her brain told her it was probably just a tree branch scraping against the door, but the primal part of her screamed that it was something far worse. She crept toward the kitchen, her bare feet silent on the cold, hardwood floor. The tapping had stopped, but now there was a new sound, a soft, rhythmic scratching like nails dragging across the wood. Kylie's breath came in shallow gasps as she reached for the knife block on the counter. Her fingers closed around the handle of the largest knife, and she gripped it tightly, her knuckles turning white. She inched closer to the door, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure whoever or whatever was on the other side could hear it. The scratching stopped abruptly, and for a moment there was only silence. Then a low, guttural whisper seeped through the crack under the door. "Kylie, let me in." Her blood turned to ice. The voice was distorted, almost inhuman, but it knew her name. She stumbled backward, nearly dropping the knife. Her mind raced. Who was out there? How did they know her name? She wanted to scream, to call for help, but her voice caught in her throat. The whisper came again, louder this time, more insistent. "Kylie, I know you're in there. Let me in." She bolted for the living room, her legs moving on their own. She grabbed her phone off the coffee table and dialed 911 with shaking hands. The line rang once, twice, and then a calm voice answered. 911, what's your emergency?" "There's someone at my door," Kylie whispered, her voice trembling. "They're trying to get in. They know my name. Please send help." The dispatcher assured her that officers were on their way, but it would take at least 15 minutes for them to reach her remote location. 15 minutes. An eternity. Kylie's eyes darted around the room, searching for a place to hide. The scratching at the door had turned into pounding, each thud reverberating through the house. She couldn't stay here. She had to move. She sprinted down the hallway to her bedroom, locking the door behind her. Her mind raced as she tried to think of what to do next. The window. She could climb out the window and run to her car. But as she approached the window, she saw him, a shadowy figure standing in the yard, staring up at her. His face was obscured by the darkness, but she could feel his eyes on her, piercing through the glass. She ducked down, her chest heaving. He was already in the yard. There was no way she could make it to her car without him seeing her. The pounding on the back door stopped, and for a moment, Kylie dared to hope that he had given up. But then she heard it, the sound of glass breaking. He was inside. Her breath hitched as she pressed herself against the wall, clutching the knife in one hand and her phone in the other. She could hear his footsteps now, slow and deliberate, moving through the house. He was searching for her. She needed a plan. She couldn't just sit here and wait for him to find her. Her eyes landed on the closet. It was small, but maybe she could hide in there until the police arrived. She crept toward it, careful not to make a sound, and slipped inside, pulling the door shut behind her. The darkness was suffocating, but it was better than being out there with him. She crouched down, her knees pressed to her chest, and tried to steady her breathing. The footsteps grew louder, closer. He was in the hallway now. She could hear him opening doors, searching each room. Her heart pounded in her ears as the footsteps stopped outside her bedroom door. The doorknob rattled, and she bit down on her lip to keep from screaming. He was trying to get in. The door creaked open, and she heard him step inside. She could see his shadow moving through the crack under the closet door. He was so close. Too close. Kylie's mind raced. What if he found her? What would he do to her? She tightened her grip on the knife, her only weapon. She would fight if she had to. She wouldn't go down without a fight. The shadow moved closer to the closet, and she held her breath, praying that he wouldn't open the door. But then the sound of sirens pierced the night air. The police were here. The intruder froze, and for a moment there was silence. Then she heard him curse under his breath and rush out of the room. Kylie waited, her body trembling, until she heard the front door slam shut. She stayed in the closet for what felt like an eternity, afraid to move, afraid that he might still be out there. Finally, she heard voices, real voices, calling her name. The police. She stumbled out of the closet, her legs weak, and made her way to the living room. 2 officers were there, their guns drawn, searching the house. They assured her that the intruder was gone, but Kylie couldn't shake the feeling of dread that clung to her like a second skin. The officers asked her questions, but she could barely focus on their words. All she could think about was the voice, the whisper, the way he had said her name. As the officers finished their search and left, promising to increase patrols in the area, Kylie sat on the couch, staring at the broken back door. She knew she wouldn't be able to sleep tonight. Every creak, every rustle of the wind made her jump. She felt violated, exposed, as if the intruder had taken something from her that she could never get back. Hours passed, and the first light of dawn began to creep through the windows. Kylie finally allowed herself to relax, just a little. She was safe. He was gone. But as she stood up to make herself a cup of tea, she noticed something on the kitchen counter that made her blood run cold. A note written in jagged, uneven letters. "I'll be back." Kylie's scream echoed through the empty house, but there was no one left to hear it. If you enjoyed this chilling tale of terror and suspense, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe for more spine-tingling stories, and ring the notification bell so you never miss a moment of the darkness. Remember, the night is never as quiet as it seems, and danger can lurk where you least expect it.
Next story.
The rain fell in relentless sheets, drumming against the windows of Amanda's small apartment. She sat cross-legged on her couch, wrapped in a blanket, scrolling through her phone. The glow of the screen illuminated her face, casting shadows that danced across the walls. It had been a long week at work and she was exhausted, but sleep felt miles away. The storm outside only added to her restlessness. That's when she opened Tinder. Amanda wasn't usually one for dating apps. She'd tried them before, but the endless swiping and shallow conversations left her feeling hollow. Still, tonight felt different. Maybe it was the storm, the way it made her feel both isolated and alive, but she decided to give it another shot. She updated her profile, adding a recent photo of herself smiling at a coffee shop, and began swiping. It didn't take long for her to match with someone. His name was Ethan, and his profile was simple but intriguing. He had a warm smile, kind eyes, and a bio that read, "Just looking for someone to share adventures with." They started chatting, and the conversation flowed effortlessly. He was funny, charming, and seemed genuinely interested in getting to know her. They talked about their favorite books, their dreams, and even their fears. Amanda found herself smiling as she typed, the storm outside fading into the background. After a few days of texting, Ethan suggested they meet in person. Amanda hesitated. She'd heard the horror stories about online dating, but Ethan seemed different. He was respectful, never pushy, and always made her laugh. She agreed to meet him at a cozy cafe downtown. The day of their date arrived, and Amanda felt a mix of excitement and nerves. She dressed carefully, choosing a simple but elegant outfit, and headed to the cafe. Ethan was already there when she arrived, sitting at a corner table with a book in hand. He looked up as she approached, his face breaking into a wide smile. He was even more handsome in person, with a quiet confidence that put her at ease. Their date went better than she could have imagined. They talked for hours, losing track of time as they shared stories and laughed together. Ethan was everything he'd seemed online, kind, thoughtful, and genuinely interested in her. By the end of the night, Amanda felt a spark of hope she hadn't felt in a long time. They started seeing each other regularly after that. Ethan would take her to little-known spots around the city, a hidden park with a stunning view, a tiny bookstore with shelves that reached the ceiling, a diner that served the best pancakes she'd ever tasted. Amanda felt like she was living in a dream, and she couldn't believe how lucky she was to have met him. But then, little things started to feel off. It began with the way Ethan would sometimes stare at her, his eyes lingering a little too long, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. Amanda brushed it off, telling herself she was being paranoid. Then there were the texts. He'd message her at odd hours, asking where she was or what she was doing. If she didn't respond right away, he'd send follow-up messages, his tone growing increasingly impatient. One night, Amanda was out with her friends when her phone buzzed. It was Ethan. "Where are you?" he asked. She told him she was with friends, and he replied, "I miss you. When will you be home?" She felt a pang of guilt, even though she knew she had no reason to. She told him she'd be home soon and tried to enjoy the rest of her night, but his words lingered in her mind. The next day, Ethan showed up at her apartment unannounced. Amanda was surprised but tried to hide her discomfort. He said he just wanted to see her, but something about the way he looked at her made her skin crawl. She invited him in, and they spent the evening together, but Amanda couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. A few days later, Amanda was walking home from work when she noticed a car following her. She quickened her pace, her heart pounding in her chest. The car slowed down, keeping pace with her. She glanced over her shoulder and saw Ethan behind the wheel. He smiled and waved, but there was something unsettling about the way he looked at her. She forced a smile and waved back, but as soon as she turned the corner, she broke into a run. When she got home, she locked the door behind her and leaned against it, trying to catch her breath. Her phone buzzed. It was Ethan. "Why did you run?" he asked. Amanda's hands trembled as she typed out a response. "I was just in a hurry," she replied. He didn't respond, but the silence felt heavier than any words. The next few days were a blur. Ethan's behavior became increasingly erratic. He'd show up at her apartment at all hours, claiming he just wanted to see her. He'd call her repeatedly, demanding to know where she was and who she was with. Amanda tried to distance herself, but every time she did, Ethan would somehow find a way to pull her back in. One night, Amanda was lying in bed when she heard a noise outside her window. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. The noise came again, a soft tapping, like someone was trying to get her attention. She slowly got out of bed and crept to the window, her hands trembling as she pulled back the curtain. Ethan was standing outside, staring up at her with a smile that sent chills down her spine. "Let me in," he said, his voice calm but insistent. Amanda shook her head, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. "Please, Ethan, go home," she whispered. His smile faded and his eyes darkened. "I just want to talk," he said, his voice low and dangerous. Amanda backed away from the window, her mind racing. She grabbed her phone and dialed 911, but before she could say anything, she heard the sound of breaking glass. Ethan had smashed the window and was climbing inside. Amanda screamed and ran for the door, but he was faster. He grabbed her by the arm, his grip like a vice, and pulled her close. "Why are you running from me?" he whispered, his breath hot against her ear. Amanda struggled against him, but he was too strong. She could feel the panic rising in her chest, threatening to overwhelm her. "Please, Ethan, let me go," she begged, tears streaming down her face. But Ethan didn't let go. Instead, he dragged her back into the apartment, his grip tightening with every step. Amanda's mind raced, searching for a way out, but she couldn't think straight. She was trapped, and there was no one to help her. The next few hours were a nightmare. Ethan kept her locked in the apartment, refusing to let her leave. He alternated between moments of calm, where he would apologize and beg for her forgiveness, and moments of rage, where he would scream at her and accuse her of betraying him. Amanda tried to reason with him, to plead with him, but nothing worked. She was completely at his mercy. As the night wore on, Amanda's fear turned to desperation. She knew she had to get out, no matter what it took. She waited until Ethan was distracted, then made a break for the door. She managed to get it open and ran out into the hallway, but Ethan was right behind her. He grabbed her by the hair and yanked her back, slamming her against the wall. Amanda's vision blurred as pain shot through her head. She could hear Ethan yelling, but his words were muffled, as if they were coming from far away. She tried to fight back, but her body wouldn't cooperate. She felt herself being dragged back into the apartment, the door slamming shut behind them. The last thing Amanda remembered was Ethan's face twisted with rage as he raised his hand and brought it down. When Amanda woke up, she was alone. The apartment was silent, and the storm outside had finally passed. She was lying on the floor, her body aching and her head throbbing. She tried to sit up, but the pain was too much. She could feel the bruises forming on her arms and legs, and her face felt swollen and tender. Amanda's phone was lying on the floor next to her, the screen cracked but still working. She reached for it with trembling hands and dialed 911. This time she managed to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. "Help me," she said. "Please help me." The police arrived quickly, but Ethan was gone. They searched the apartment and the surrounding area, but there was no sign of him. Amanda was taken to the hospital where she was treated for her injuries. The doctors and nurses were kind, but Amanda could see the pity in their eyes. She knew they'd seen this before, and it broke her heart. In the days that followed, Amanda tried to piece her life back together. She moved out of her apartment and stayed with a friend, too afraid to go back to the place where she'd been held captive. She changed her phone number and deleted her social media accounts, hoping to cut off any way for Ethan to contact her. But Ethan wasn't done with her. A few weeks after the attack, Amanda received a package in the mail. It was a small box, wrapped in plain brown paper, with no return address. She opened it cautiously, her hands trembling as she lifted the lid. Inside was a single photograph. It was a picture of her taken from outside her new apartment window. She was sitting on the couch, unaware that she was being watched. On the back of the photo, written in bold, black letters, were the words, "I'm still watching." Amanda's heart sank as she realized that Ethan had found her. He was still out there, still watching, still waiting. She felt a wave of helplessness wash over her, knowing that no matter where she went, no matter what she did, he would always be there, lurking in the shadows. The police were called, but there was little they could do. Without any concrete evidence, they couldn't arrest Ethan. Amanda was left to live in fear, constantly looking over her shoulder, wondering if he was watching her at that very moment. Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months. Amanda tried to move on, but the fear never left her. She jumped at every noise, every shadow, every unexpected knock at the door. She stopped going out at night, stopped seeing her friends, stopped living her life. Amanda knew she would never truly be free of Ethan. He would always be there, lurking in the back of her mind, a constant reminder of the nightmare she'd lived through. And she knew that no matter how far she ran, no matter how much time passed, she would always be looking over her shoulder, waiting for him to reappear. Because Ethan wasn't just a man, he was a monster, and monsters never truly go away. If you enjoyed this spine-chilling tale of suspense and terror, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss another story. Remember, the world can be a dark and unpredictable place. Stay aware, stay safe, and always trust your instincts.
Next story.
The small town of Black Hollow was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business. Nestled deep within a dense forest, it was a town that seemed perpetually shrouded in a misty gloom, even on the sunniest of days. The streets were lined with old creaky houses, their paint peeling and windows dark. It was the kind of town where children dared each other to walk past the abandoned mill at the edge of the woods, where whispers of old tragedies lingered in the air like ghosts. Megan Carter had lived in Black Hollow her entire life. At 23, she was a bright, ambitious young woman with dreams of leaving the town behind and starting a new life in the city. She worked at the local library during the day and spent her evenings sketching in her notebook, her mind filled with designs for the fashion line she hoped to one day create. But Megan's life was about to take a dark and terrifying turn, one that would plunge her into a nightmare she could never have imagined. It started with the letters. At first, they seemed harmless enough. Anonymous notes left in her mailbox, filled with cryptic compliments and vague declarations of admiration. "Your smile lights up the darkest corners of this town," one read. "I watch you from afar, and you are more beautiful every day," said another. Megan brushed them off, assuming they were from some shy admirer who would eventually work up the courage to introduce themselves. But as the weeks went by, the letters grew more frequent and more unsettling. "I know you like to sit by the window when you sketch. The moonlight makes you look like an angel. You always wear that blue scarf on Tuesdays. It's my favorite." Megan's initial amusement turned to unease. Someone was watching her, someone who knew her routines, her habits, her life. She began to feel a constant prickling sensation on the back of her neck, as though unseen eyes were following her every move. One evening, as Megan walked home from the library, she noticed a figure standing beneath the flickering street lamp at the end of her block. The person was too far away to make out any details, but something about the way they stood, completely still, unnaturally so, sent a shiver down her spine. She quickened her pace, her heart pounding in her chest. When she glanced back, the figure was gone. That night, she double-checked the locks on her doors and windows, something she had never felt the need to do before. As she lay in bed, she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. The house creaked and groaned, the wind howling outside her window. She told herself it was just her imagination, but deep down, she knew better. The next morning, Megan found another letter waiting for her. This one was different. The handwriting was jagged, almost frantic, and the words sent a chill through her veins. "You looked so beautiful last night, running from me. But you can't run forever, Megan. I'm coming for you." Her hands trembled as she read the note over and over, her mind racing. Who was doing this? Why were they targeting her? She thought about going to the police, but what could she tell them? That she was receiving creepy letters? They would probably laugh it off, tell her to be more careful. But Megan knew this wasn't just some harmless prank. This was something far more sinister. Over the next few days, the letters continued to arrive, each one more disturbing than the last. I can hear you crying at night. It's such a beautiful sound. I was in your house last night. You looked so peaceful, sleeping in your bed. Megan's fear grew with each passing day. She started sleeping with a knife under her pillow, jumping at every sound. She stopped going out after dark, avoiding the streets she used to walk without a second thought. But no matter how careful she was, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Her once peaceful life had become a living nightmare, and she had no idea how to escape it. Then, one night, the unthinkable happened. Megan was in her kitchen making a cup of tea when she heard a noise coming from the living room. It was a soft, almost imperceptible sound like the creak of a floorboard. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. The house was silent except for the steady ticking of the clock on the wall. She told herself it was nothing, just the old house settling, but deep down she knew better. Slowly, she reached for the knife she kept on the counter, her fingers trembling as she wrapped them around the handle. She crept toward the living room, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure whoever was there could hear it. The room was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the street lamp outside. She scanned the shadows, her eyes darting from corner to corner, and then she saw it, a figure standing in the far corner of the room, completely still, watching her. Megan's scream tore through the silence, but before she could react, the figure lunged at her. She swung the knife wildly, but it was knocked from her hand with ease. Strong arms wrapped around her, pulling her into a suffocating embrace. She struggled with all her might, kicking and clawing, but it was no use. The figure was too strong. She felt a sharp pain in her side, and then everything went black. When Megan woke up, she was in a place she didn't recognize. The air was damp and cold, the walls made of rough, unfinished stone. She was lying on a thin, dirty mattress, her hands and feet bound with thick rope. Panic surged through her as she realized where she was. A basement, or maybe a cellar. The only light came from a single flickering bulb hanging from the ceiling. She tried to scream, but a rag had been stuffed into her mouth, muffling her cries. Her mind raced as she tried to piece together what had happened. Who had taken her? What did they want? And then she heard it, the sound of footsteps descending the stairs. Her heart pounded as the door creaked open, and the figure from her living room stepped into the room. It was a man, tall and thin, with hollow cheeks and sunken eyes. His hair was greasy, hanging in limp strands around his face. He was wearing a tattered coat, the sleeves stained with what looked like dried blood. Megan's breath came in short, panicked gasps as he approached her, a twisted smile on his face. "Hello, Megan," he said, his voice low and raspy. "I've been waiting for this moment for so long." He reached out, his fingers brushing against her cheek, and she recoiled in horror. "Don't be afraid," he whispered. "We're going to have so much fun together." The days, or maybe it was weeks, Megan couldn't tell, blurred together in a haze of terror and pain. Her captor, who called himself the Collector, visited her regularly, sometimes bringing food and water, other times just to taunt her. He told her about the other girls he had taken, the ones who hadn't been as special as she was. He spoke of their screams, their tears, their final moments, as though they were nothing more than stories to entertain her. Megan's mind began to fracture under the weight of her fear and despair. She cried herself to sleep every night, her body aching from the cold and the rough treatment. She thought about giving up, about letting the darkness take her, but something inside her refused to let go. She had to survive. She had to escape. One night, as the Collector was leaving, Megan noticed something she hadn't before. a loose stone in the wall near the door. Her heart leapt with hope as she realized it might be her only chance. She waited until she was sure he was gone, then began to work at the stone with her bound hands. It was slow, painful work, but she didn't care. She had to get out. Finally, after what felt like hours, the stone came loose. She reached into the hole, her fingers brushing against something cold and metallic. It was a key. Tears streamed down her face as she fumbled with the lock on her restraints, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold the key. But finally, the lock clicked open, and she was free. Megan didn't stop to think. She ran for the stairs, her legs weak and unsteady, but fueled by sheer adrenaline. The door at the top was locked, but she threw herself against it again and again until it finally gave way. She stumbled into the night, the cold air hitting her like a slap. She didn't know where she was, but she didn't care. She just had to get away. She ran through the woods, branches tearing at her skin, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She could hear him behind her, his footsteps pounding against the ground, his voice calling out to her, "Megan, come back! You can't escape me!" But she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. Finally, she burst out of the woods and onto a deserted road. She could see lights in the distance, a house maybe, or a gas station. She ran toward them, her legs screaming in protest, her vision blurring with tears. She didn't dare look back. She didn't want to see how close he was. She reached the house and pounded on the door, screaming for help. The door opened, and a man stood there, his face a mixture of shock and concern. "Please," Megan gasped, collapsing into his arms. "Help me, he's coming." The police arrived soon after, but by the time they searched the woods, the collector was gone. All they found was the cellar, empty except for the dirty mattress and the flickering light. Megan was taken to the hospital where she was treated for her injuries and questioned by the police. She told them everything she could remember, but it wasn't much. She didn't know his real name, or where he had taken her, or where he might be now. The police assured her they would do everything they could to find him, but Megan knew the truth. He was still out there, watching, waiting, and he wasn't done with her. Megan tried to go back to her normal life, but it was impossible. She jumped at every sound, every shadow. She couldn't sleep without the lights on, and even then, she would wake up screaming, convinced he was in the room with her. She quit her job at the library and rarely left the house. Her dreams of leaving Black Hollow were gone, replaced by a paralyzing fear that kept her trapped in the town she had once longed to escape. And then one day, she found another letter in her mailbox. The handwriting was the same, the words sending a chill through her veins. "You thought you could get away from me, Megan, but you were wrong. I'm still here, and I'm coming for you." Megan's story is a chilling reminder that evil can lurk in the most unexpected places, and that sometimes the monsters we fear are all too real. The collector was never caught, and to this day, Megan lives in fear, knowing that he could be watching her, waiting for the perfect moment to strike again. And so, the town of Black Hollow remains shrouded in its perpetual gloom, a place where the shadows hold secrets too terrifying to imagine. If you enjoyed this spine-chilling tale of terror, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss a story. And remember, the scariest truth of all is that monsters don't just live in the shadows, they walk among us, hidden in plain sight.
Next story.
Brittany had always been a light sleeper. The faintest creak of the floorboards or the softest rustle of leaves outside her window would jolt her awake. It was both a blessing and a curse, especially now that she was living alone in her small, dimly lit flat on the outskirts of the university campus. The flat was old, with peeling wallpaper and a persistent draft that slithered through the cracks in the windows. It wasn't much, but it was hers. A sanctuary away from the chaos of dorm life, or so she thought. It started with the sounds. At first, Brittany dismissed them as the usual noises of an old building settling at night. The faint tapping on the window, the soft scraping against the walls, the occasional creak of the stairs leading up to her second-floor flat. But as the days turned into weeks, the sounds grew louder, more deliberate. They seemed to follow her, echoing in the silence whenever she was alone. She tried to convince herself it was her imagination, but deep down, she knew something was wrong. One night, as she lay in bed, her phone buzzed on the nightstand. She reached for it, her heart skipping a beat when she saw the notification, a message from an unknown number. Her fingers trembled as she opened it. "I like the way you brush your hair at night. So careful, so graceful. Do you know I'm watching?" Brittany's breath hitched. She dropped the phone as if it had burned her, her mind racing. Who could have sent this? How could they know? She glanced around her room, her eyes darting to the shadows in the corners. The air felt heavier, colder, as if someone else was in the room with her. She grabbed her phone again, her fingers fumbling as she blocked the number and turned off her notifications. But the damage was done. Sleep didn't come that night. The next morning, Brittany tried to shake off the unease. She told herself it was just a prank, some idiot trying to scare her. But as she walked to her morning lecture, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The back of her neck prickled, and she kept glancing over her shoulder, half expecting to see someone following her. The campus was bustling with students, but the noise and chatter did little to calm her nerves. That evening, as she unlocked her flat door, she noticed something strange. The door was slightly ajar, the lock scratched and dented. Her heart pounded as she pushed it open, her hand trembling on the doorknob. The flat was dark, the only light coming from the street lamp outside. She flicked on the switch, her breath catching in her throat. The place had been ransacked. Drawers were pulled open, their contents spilled onto the floor. Her books were scattered, her clothes strewn across the bed. But what terrified her the most was the message scrawled on the mirror in red lipstick. "I was here, you weren't home, next time I'll wait." Brittany stumbled back, her legs giving way as she collapsed onto the floor. She clutched her chest, her breaths coming in shallow gasps. Someone had been in her flat. Someone had touched her things, stood in her space, invaded her life. She felt violated, exposed, as if the walls of her sanctuary had been torn down. She called the police, her voice shaking as she explained what had happened. They arrived quickly, taking her statement and dusting for fingerprints. But they found nothing. No evidence, no leads, just a broken lock and a message on the mirror. They told her to be careful, to lock her doors and windows, to stay vigilant. But Brittany already knew that. She had never felt more vulnerable in her life. The days that followed were a blur of fear and paranoia. Brittany installed extra locks on her doors and windows, bought 2 security cameras, and kept a knife under her pillow. She jumped at every sound, every shadow, every knock on the door. But the stalker was always one step ahead. One night, as she sat at her desk studying, her phone buzzed again. Another message from an unknown number. "You look beautiful when you're scared. I can see you right now." Brittany's blood ran cold. She glanced at the security camera feeds on her laptop. The screen showed her flat, empty, and still. But then she noticed something, a faint movement. She zoomed in, her heart pounding as she realized what it was. A pair of eyes, staring directly into the camera. She screamed, slamming the laptop shut. Her hands shook as she grabbed her phone and dialed the police. But before she could speak, she heard it, the sound of footsteps outside her door, slow, deliberate, coming closer. She froze, her breath caught in her throat. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, there was silence. Then the doorknob began to turn. Brittany's mind raced. She grabbed the knife from under her pillow and backed into the corner of the room, her eyes fixed on the door. The knob turned again, more forcefully this time, and the door creaked open. A figure stepped inside, silhouetted against the dim light from the hallway. It was him. Brittany's scream tore through the silence as she lunged forward, slashing wildly with the knife. The figure dodged, grabbing her wrist and twisting it until the knife clattered to the floor. She struggled, kicking and screaming, but he was too strong. He pinned her against the wall, his breath hot on her face. "Quiet," he whispered, his voice low and calm. "I'm not gonna hurt you, not yet." Brittany's vision blurred as tears streamed down her face. She could feel his grip tightening, his other hand reaching for something in his pocket. She closed her eyes, praying for it to be over, for someone to save her. But no one came. And then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, he was gone. Brittany collapsed to the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. She didn't know how long she sat there, her body trembling, her mind numb. But when she finally looked up, she saw it, a single red rose lying on her bed, a note attached. "Until next time, Brittany." Brittany's breath came in ragged gasps as she stared at the rose, its crimson petals a stark contrast against the pale sheets of her bed. The note, written in the same meticulous handwriting as the message on the mirror, sent a fresh wave of terror coursing through her veins. She couldn't stay here. Not anymore. The flat, once her sanctuary, now felt like a prison, a trap designed to suffocate her. With trembling hands, she grabbed her phone and dialed her best friend, Mia. The phone rang twice before Mia's groggy voice answered. "Britt, it's 2 a.m. What's wrong?" "He was here," Brittany choked out, her voice breaking. "He was in my flat. He touched me, Mia. He left a rose. I can't stay here. Please, I need you." Mia was wide awake now. "I'm coming. Pack a bag. You're staying with me tonight." Brittany didn't need to be told twice. She threw clothes, her laptop, and a few essentials into a duffel bag, her movements frantic. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind outside made her freeze, her heart pounding in her chest. She kept glancing at the door, half expecting him to burst through it again. By the time Mia arrived, Brittany was a trembling mess. Mia took one look at her and pulled her into a tight hug. "We're gonna figure this out," she said firmly. "You're not alone in this." At Mia's apartment, Brittany finally felt a semblance of safety, but sleep still eluded her. She lay on the couch, staring at the ceiling, replaying the night's events in her mind. Who was he? Why was he doing this? And how did he know so much about her? The next morning, Mia insisted they go to the police again. This time, Brittany brought the rose and the note. The officers took her more seriously now, but their options were limited. Without a name or a face, there was little they could do. Desperate for answers, Brittany decided to take matters into her own hands. She began piecing together every detail she could remember, the messages, the break-in, the way he moved, the things he said. She scoured social media, looking for any clues, any connections. And then she found something. A photo from a university event months ago. In the background, barely visible, was a man staring directly at the camera, at her. His face was partially obscured, but there was something familiar about his eyes. The same eyes she had seen on the security camera feed. Brittany's stomach churned as she zoomed in on the photo. She didn't recognize him, but she knew someone who might. She sent the photo to her professor, Dr. Langston, who had been at the event. His response came quickly. "That's Ethan Grayson. He was a student here a few years ago, dropped out under questionable circumstances. Why do you ask?" Brittany's hands shook as she typed her reply. "I think he's been stalking me." Dr. Langston's next message was a bombshell. Ethan was obsessed with a student back then, too. Her name was Claire. She disappeared. The police suspected foul play, but they never found enough evidence to charge him. Brittany's blood ran cold. Claire. The name echoed in her mind, a ghost from the past. She began digging deeper, uncovering news articles about Claire's disappearance. The similarities were chilling. The messages, the break-ins, the rows. Ethan had done this before, and now he had chosen her. But why? What connected her to Claire? Brittany's mind raced as she searched for answers, and then she found it. A photo of Claire, smiling brightly, her arm around a younger version of Brittany's mother. They had been friends, close friends. Brittany's heart sank as the pieces fell into place. This wasn't random. Ethan hadn't chosen her by chance. He had been watching her for years, waiting for the right moment to strike. And now, he was closing in. Determined to end the nightmare, Brittany decided to confront him. With Mia's help, she set a trap. They leaked false information about her whereabouts, luring Ethan to an abandoned building on the edge of town. The police were waiting, hidden, ready to arrest him. But Ethan was smarter than they thought. He didn't take the bait. Instead, he sent Brittany one final message. "You can't escape me, Brittany. I'm part of you now, just like I was part of Claire." The message sent a shiver down her spine. She realized then that this wasn't just about her or Claire. It was about control, about power, and Ethan wasn't going to stop until he had both. Brittany knew what she had to do. She couldn't run anymore. She had to face him to end this once and for all. With Mia by her side and the police on standby, she prepared for the final confrontation. But as she stood in the dimly lit building, waiting for Ethan to appear, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking into a trap. The air was thick with tension, every sound amplified in the silence. And then she heard it. The soft, deliberate footsteps echoing through the empty halls. He was here. Brittany's heart pounded as she gripped the pepper spray in her hand. She could feel Mia's presence beside her, a silent reassurance. But as the footsteps grew closer, she realized something was wrong. The footsteps weren't coming from the direction they expected. And then the lights went out. In the darkness, Brittany's fear became a living, breathing entity, suffocating her as she struggled to outwit a predator who seemed to know her every move before she made it. The game of cat and mouse had reached its end, and only one of them would walk away. If you enjoyed this spine-chilling story, don't forget to subscribe for more thrilling tales that will keep you on the edge of your seat. And always remember that sometimes the darkest shadows are closer than they appear. Stay safe, stay aware, and keep your doors locked, because you never know who might be watching.
Next story.
Sophie had always been a creature of habit. Her life in the quiet town of Willowbrook was predictable, almost mundane, but she liked it that way. Every morning, she would wake up at 6:30 a.m., brew a pot of coffee, and sit by the window to watch the sunrise. She worked as a librarian at the local library, a job that suited her introverted nature perfectly. The library was her sanctuary, a place where she could lose herself in the pages of old books and forget about the world outside. But little did she know, her peaceful life was about to be shattered. It started with small things, things that Sophie could almost convince herself were just coincidences. A book she hadn't checked out appearing on her desk, the faint sound of footsteps behind her when she walked home at night, the feeling of being watched as she browsed the shelves. At first, she brushed it off. Maybe she had just forgotten about the book, or perhaps the footsteps belonged to a neighbor. But deep down, a gnawing sense of unease began to take root. One evening, as Sophie was closing up the library, she noticed something strange. The security camera in the corner of the room, usually a steady red dot in the darkness, was off. She frowned, walking over to inspect it. The power cord had been unplugged. Her heart skipped a beat. She was sure she hadn't touched it. She quickly plugged it back in and hurried home, her footsteps echoing in the empty streets. That night, Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She double-checked the locks on her doors and windows, something she had never done before. As she lay in bed, she heard a faint tapping sound coming from her living room. Her breath caught in her throat. She told herself it was just the wind, but the sound was too deliberate, too rhythmic. She grabbed her phone, her hands trembling, and crept out of bed. The tapping stopped as soon as she entered the living room. The room was dark, the only light coming from the street lamp outside. She scanned the room, her heart pounding, but there was nothing there. Just as she was about to turn back, she noticed something on the coffee table, a single, crumpled page from a book. It was a page from a novel she had been reading earlier that day. The words were circled in red ink. "You can't hide from me." Sophie's blood ran cold. She dropped the page and backed away, her mind racing. Who could have done this? How had they gotten into her house? She grabbed her keys and ran out the door, not even bothering to put on shoes. She didn't stop running until she reached the police station. The officers took her statement, but without any evidence, there was little they could do. They told her to be careful and to call if anything else happened. The next few days were a blur of fear and paranoia. Sophie couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. Every sound made her jump, every shadow seemed to move. She started carrying a small pocket knife with her, though she doubted it would do much good. The library, once her safe haven, now felt like a trap. She began to notice more strange things. Books out of place, her desk drawer slightly ajar, the faint smell of cologne in the air. She tried to convince herself it was all in her head, but the fear was relentless. Then, one night, the unthinkable happened. Sophie was walking home from the library, her usual route taking her through a quiet park. The park was usually deserted at this hour, but tonight it felt different. The air was heavy, the silence oppressive. She quickened her pace, her eyes darting around. Suddenly she heard footsteps behind her. She turned, but there was no one there. Her heart raced as she started to run, the sound of footsteps growing louder. She didn't look back, didn't stop until she reached her house. She fumbled with the keys, her hands shaking so badly she could barely get the door open. She slammed it shut behind her and leaned against it, gasping for breath. But the nightmare wasn't over. As she turned on the lights, she saw him, a figure standing in the corner of her living room, his face obscured by shadows. Sophie screamed, but no sound came out. She backed away, her mind screaming at her to run, but her legs wouldn't move. The figure stepped forward, and she saw his face for the first time. It was someone she knew, someone she had trusted. It was Mark, the janitor at the library. He had always been quiet, unassuming. She had never thought twice about him, but now his eyes were cold, his smile twisted. "You shouldn't have run, Sophie," he said, his voice low and menacing. "I've been watching you for so long. You're mine now." Sophie's mind raced. She had to think of something, anything. She glanced at the door, but Mark was blocking her way. She looked around the room, her eyes landing on the fireplace. There was a poker leaning against the mantel. She lunged for it, but Mark was faster. He grabbed her arm, his grip like iron. She struggled, kicking and screaming, but he was too strong. He dragged her toward the basement, his breath hot on her neck. The basement was dark, the air thick with the smell of damp earth. Mark threw her to the ground, and she hit her head on the concrete floor. Pain exploded in her skull, and she felt herself slipping into unconsciousness. The last thing she saw was Mark's face, his eyes gleaming with malice. When Sophie woke up, she was tied to a chair, her arms and legs bound with thick rope. The basement was still dark, but she could make out the shapes of tools hanging on the walls, tools that sent a chill down her spine. Mark was standing in front of her, a knife in his hand. He smiled when he saw she was awake. "You're finally mine," he said, running the blade along her cheek. "I've waited so long for this." Sophie's mind raced. She had to get out of here. She had to survive. She looked around the room, her eyes landing on a small window near the ceiling. It was her only chance. She pretended to sob, her body shaking with fear. Mark leaned in closer, his breath hot on her face. She waited for the right moment, then kicked out with all her strength, her foot connecting with his knee. He stumbled back, and she used the opportunity to tip the chair over, crashing to the ground. The impact knocked the wind out of her, but she didn't stop. She wriggled her hands free and grabbed the knife Mark had dropped. She cut the ropes binding her legs and scrambled to her feet. Mark was already recovering, his eyes blazing with anger. He lunged at her, but she sidestepped, slashing at him with the knife. The blade caught his arm, and he howled in pain. She didn't wait to see if he would recover. She ran for the stairs, her heart pounding in her chest. She could hear him behind her, his footsteps heavy on the stairs. She burst through the door and into the living room, her eyes darting around for something, anything to defend herself with. She grabbed a lamp and hurled it at him as he came through the door. It hit him in the face, and he staggered back. Sophie didn't wait. She ran out the front door and into the night, her bare feet slapping against the pavement. She didn't stop running until she reached the police station. The officers took her statement, and this time they believed her. They found Mark in her house, still dazed from the blow to the head. He was arrested, and Sophie was finally safe. But the nightmare wasn't over. Even though Mark was behind bars, Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that she was still being watched. She moved to a new town, changed her name, and tried to start over. But every night, as she lay in bed, she would hear the faint sound of tapping, and she would wonder if he had found her again. The fear never left her, a constant reminder of the night she had almost lost everything. And so, Sophie's life became a never-ending cycle of fear and paranoia. She had escaped, but the scars remained, a constant reminder of the horror she had endured. And as she lay in bed each night, listening to the sound of tapping, she couldn't help but wonder if she would ever truly be free. If you enjoyed this chilling tale of Sophie's harrowing escape, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell icon so you never miss a spine-chilling story. And remember, in the quiet of the night, when the shadows seem to move and the air feels just a little too still, you might not be as alone as you think.
Next story.
The rain had been falling for hours by the time Samantha pulled up to the Airbnb. The house was nestled deep in the woods, miles from the nearest town. It was the kind of place that looked picturesque in photos, a charming rustic cabin surrounded by towering pines. But in person, under the gray, stormy sky, it felt different. The windows seemed to stare at her like hollow eyes, and the porch creaked ominously as she stepped onto it. She shook off the unease, telling herself it was just the weather making her jumpy. The host, Greg, had been friendly in their messages. He'd even left a note on the kitchen counter. "Welcome, Samantha. Make yourself at home. The woods are beautiful but can be unpredictable. Stay safe." She'd smiled at the time, thinking it was just a quirky warning. Now, as she stood in the dimly lit kitchen, the note felt more foreboding than welcoming. The first night was quiet, save for the rain and the occasional creak of the old house. Samantha spent the evening unpacking and settling in. She noticed little things: a locked door in the hallway, a faint smell of mildew in the bathroom, and a strange scratching sound coming from the walls. She told herself it was just the house settling, or maybe an animal in the attic. But as the night deepened, the scratching grew louder, more deliberate. It sounded like it was moving. She froze, her tea cooling in her hands, and listened. The sound stopped. She exhaled, chiding herself for being jumpy, and went to bed. The next morning, the sun broke through the clouds, and the woods looked less intimidating. Samantha decided to explore the area, hoping to clear her head. She followed a narrow trail behind the house, the air thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. The woods were eerily quiet, no birds chirping, no rustling of leaves, just silence. She walked for about 20 minutes before she stumbled upon something that made her blood run cold: a small, makeshift shed hidden among the trees. The door was slightly ajar, and inside she saw tools, ropes, and a stack of Polaroid photos. Her stomach churned as she picked one up. It was a picture of a woman, bound and gagged, her eyes wide with terror. Samantha dropped the photo and backed away, her heart pounding. She turned to run, but froze when she heard a twig snap behind her. "Beautiful, isn't it?" a voice said. She spun around to see Greg, the host, standing a few feet away. He was smiling, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I didn't expect you to find this place so soon," he said, stepping closer. Samantha's mind raced. She forced a smile, trying to play it cool. "Oh, I was just exploring. This is quite the collection you have here." Greg chuckled, but it was a cold, hollow sound. "I'm glad you like it. You'll be part of it soon enough." Before she could react, he lunged at her. Samantha screamed and bolted, crashing through the underbrush. Branches clawed at her face and arms, but she didn't stop. She could hear Greg behind her, his footsteps heavy and deliberate. She didn't look back. She ran until her lungs burned, finally stumbling back to the house. She slammed the door shut and locked it, her hands trembling. She grabbed her phone to call for help, but there was no signal. The power was out again, and the house was plunged into darkness. She heard Greg's voice outside. "You can't stay in there forever, Samantha!" Panic set in as she searched for a way out. The windows were too high to jump from, and the doors were the only exits. She remembered the locked door in the hallway. Desperate, she grabbed a fire poker from the fireplace and smashed the lock. The door creaked open to reveal a narrow staircase leading down to a basement. The air was damp and cold, and the smell of mildew was overwhelming. She descended slowly, her heart pounding in her ears. The basement was dimly lit by a single bulb hanging from the ceiling. What she saw made her stomach turn: chains bolted to the wall, a blood-stained mattress, and more Polaroid photos pinned to a corkboard. Her photo was already there, circled in red. She heard the front door creak open upstairs. Greg was inside the house. She had to hide. She spotted a small closet in the corner and squeezed inside, pulling the door shut just as footsteps echoed down the stairs. She held her breath, clutching the fire poker tightly. Greg's voice was soft, almost sing-song. "Samantha, I know you're down here. You can't hide from me." She heard him moving around, his footsteps getting closer. She pressed her hand to her mouth to stifle a sob. The closet door rattled as he tested the handle. "Found you," he whispered. In a burst of adrenaline, she kicked the door open, catching him off guard. She swung the fire poker with all her strength, hitting him in the side of the head. He staggered back, and she bolted up the stairs. She didn't stop to see if he was following. She ran out the front door and into the woods, the rain soaking her within seconds. She didn't know where she was going, but she knew she had to get away. The woods seemed endless, the trees closing in around her. She tripped over a root and fell, her ankle twisting painfully. She scrambled to her feet, but it was too late. Greg emerged from the shadows, his face bleeding, his eyes wild. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he said, grabbing her by the arm. She screamed, kicking and thrashing, but he was too strong. He dragged her back toward the house, her cries swallowed by the storm. Just as they reached the porch, a car's headlights cut through the darkness. Greg froze, his grip tightening. A man stepped out of the car holding a flashlight. "Everything okay here?" he called out. Samantha seized the moment, wrenching herself free and running toward the man. "Help me, he's trying to kill me," she screamed. Greg hesitated, then turned and disappeared into the woods. The man, a local named Tom, helped Samantha into his car and called the police. As they waited, Samantha broke down, sobbing uncontrollably. The police arrived and searched the house, finding the basement and the shed. Greg was nowhere to be found. They assured Samantha they would catch him, but she knew he was still out there, watching, waiting. Weeks later, Samantha tried to move on, but the nightmares wouldn't stop. She moved to a new city, changed her number, and tried to forget. One night, as she was unpacking a box, she found something that made her blood run cold. A Polaroid photo of herself, taken the night she escaped. On the back, in familiar handwriting, it read, "You can't hide from me." If you enjoyed this spine-chilling tale of survival and terror, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss a story. Remember, the world can be a beautiful place, but it's also home to shadows we can't always see. Stay aware, stay safe, and trust your instincts, because sometimes the scariest stories are the ones that could happen to anyone.
Next story.
The forest was alive with the sounds of rustling leaves and distant animal calls as Emily and Matthew set up their campsite. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the clearing they had chosen. Emily had always loved the idea of camping, the serenity of nature, the escape from the hustle and bustle of everyday life. Matthew, ever the adventurer, had suggested this trip as a way to reconnect after a particularly stressful few months at work. They had been looking forward to this for weeks, and now, as they pitched their tent and gathered firewood, the excitement was palpable. The first night was perfect. They cooked dinner over the fire, the flames crackling and sending sparks into the night sky. They talked and laughed, the kind of deep, meaningful conversations that only seem to happen when you're surrounded by nature. The stars above were breathtaking, a blanket of light that seemed to stretch on forever. They fell asleep in each other's arms, the sounds of the forest lulling them into a peaceful slumber. But the next morning, things began to feel off. Emily woke up first, the sun just beginning to peek through the trees. She stretched and yawned, feeling a sense of unease she couldn't quite place. The forest was quiet, too quiet. The usual morning chorus of birds was absent, replaced by an eerie silence that made her skin crawl. She shook Matthew awake, and he immediately noticed it too. "Something's not right," he said, his voice low. "It's too quiet." They decided to pack up and head back to the car. But as they began to gather their things, they realized that their map was missing. They had left it on a rock near the fire pit the night before, but now it was gone. Emily felt a chill run down her spine. They were deep in the woods, miles from the nearest town, and without the map, they had no idea which direction to go. As they debated what to do, they heard a noise in the distance. It was faint, but unmistakable, a low, guttural growl that sent shivers down their spines. They froze, listening intently. The sound came again, closer this time. Matthew grabbed Emily's hand, and they began to move quickly through the trees, their hearts pounding in their chests. The forest seemed to close in around them as they ran, the trees growing denser and the underbrush thicker. They could hear the sound of footsteps behind them, heavy and deliberate, but when they turned to look, there was nothing there. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming, and Emily's breath came in short, panicked gasps. They stumbled upon a small cabin in the woods, its windows dark and its door slightly ajar. It looked abandoned, but they had no other options. They rushed inside, slamming the door shut behind them and barricading it with a heavy wooden table. The cabin was musty and damp, the air thick with the smell of mildew. There was a single room with a rickety bed, a table, and a few chairs. A fireplace sat cold and empty in the corner. Emily and Matthew huddled together, their ears straining for any sound from outside. For a moment, there was nothing. Then they heard it, a slow, deliberate knock on the door. It was soft, almost polite, but it sent a wave of terror through them. The knock came again, louder this time, and then again and again, until it was a relentless pounding that shook the door on its hinges. "Let me in," a voice called from outside, low and menacing. "I just want to talk." Emily's heart was racing, her mind screaming at her to run, but there was nowhere to go. Matthew grabbed a knife from the table, his hands trembling as he held it out in front of him. The pounding stopped, and for a moment there was silence. Then the door began to creak open, the table they had used to barricade it sliding across the floor. A figure stepped inside, tall and gaunt, with hollow eyes and a twisted smile. He was holding a hunting knife, the blade glinting in the dim light. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she realized who it was. A man they had passed on the trail the day before. He had seemed friendly at the time, offering them advice on the best spots to camp. But now his eyes were filled with a madness that made her blood run cold. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his voice a low growl. "This is my forest." Matthew lunged at him, the knife in his hand flashing as he swung. The man dodged easily, his movements unnaturally fast. He grabbed Matthew by the wrist, twisting it until the knife clattered to the floor. Emily screamed, rushing forward to help, but the man backhanded her, sending her sprawling to the ground. Matthew struggled, but the man was too strong. He pinned him to the floor, his knife pressed against his throat. Emily scrambled to her feet, her mind racing. She grabbed a chair and swung it at the man's head with all her might. It connected with a sickening crack, and he stumbled back, releasing Matthew. "Run!" Emily screamed, grabbing Matthew's hand and pulling him towards the door. They burst out into the forest, the man's enraged screams echoing behind them. They ran blindly, their feet pounding against the forest floor, branches whipping at their faces. They could hear him behind them, his footsteps heavy and relentless. They stumbled upon a river, the water rushing fast and cold. Without hesitation, they plunged in, the icy water stealing their breath. They swam to the other side, their clothes soaked and heavy, and collapsed on the bank, gasping for air. They could still hear the man on the other side, his screams of rage fading as they disappeared into the trees. They didn't stop running until they reached the car, their bodies trembling with exhaustion and fear. They drove away as fast as they could, the forest disappearing in the rearview mirror. They didn't speak, the horror of what had happened too fresh, too raw. But as they drove, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. She kept glancing in the rearview mirror, expecting to see the man's twisted smile staring back at her. And when they finally reached the safety of their home, they locked the doors and windows, but the fear didn't leave them. It lingered, a shadow that followed them wherever they went. They never went camping again. The forest, once a place of peace and beauty, had become a nightmare they couldn't escape. And every night, as they lay in bed, they could still hear the man's voice, low and menacing, whispering in the darkness. Let me in. If you enjoyed this chilling tale, don't forget to subscribe for more spine-tingling stories. And remember, sometimes the scariest things aren't what lurk in the shadows, but what follows you home. Until next time, sleep tight.